When my father died, everyone already knew who would inherit everything. My older brother Daniel, the golden child, the future CEO, the favorite. The lawyer opened Dad's will. The family business, the family home, the investment accounts will all go to Daniel Harper. Daniel smiled. My stepmother wiped away tears of relief. Then the lawyer reached into his briefcase one last time. There is one final item. He placed an old leather notebook in front of me. Daniel laughed. So Dad left you his diary? I smiled, because I remembered something Dad once told me. If anyone fights over what I own, they're already looking at the wrong thing. 3 months later, Daniel would offer me $50 million for that notebook. My name is Noah Harper. My father built Harper Manufacturing from a tiny machine shop into one of the largest industrial companies in the state. To everyone else, Daniel was the obvious successor. He loved boardrooms, meetings, and expensive suits. I preferred the factory floor. I spent my afternoons learning from welders, mechanics, and machinists. Dad rarely praised me, but whenever he found me fixing an old machine, he'd quietly smile. One afternoon, he placed his hand on a hydraulic press and said, "Most people think companies are built in boardrooms. They're wrong. They're built right here." I never forgot those words. When Dad became seriously ill, Daniel immediately started acting like CEO. He replaced experienced managers with college friends. He cut maintenance budgets. He talked about profits. Dad never argued. Instead, he spent more time beside me in the workshop. One evening, he handed me the same leather notebook. Read the first page. It said, "Machines break because people ignore small problems." I frowned. This isn't about machines. Dad smiled. No, it's about people. A week before he died, he called me to the hospital. "I need one promise. Don't fight your brother." Then he handed me the notebook. "I've been writing in this for 30 years. It's everything." Before I could ask why, the nurses came in. 3 days later, Dad was gone. The lawyer read the will exactly as everyone expected. Daniel inherited the company, the house, the investments, everything. Then the lawyer handed me Dad's notebook. Daniel couldn't stop laughing. "He gets $80 million, and you get an old notebook." I simply picked it up. For some reason, it felt heavier than it should. Within days, Daniel became CEO. He announced a modernization plan. Longtime employees were fired. Managers Dad trusted for decades were escorted out by security. I confronted him. "They helped Dad build this company." "They're too expensive," Daniel replied. "No, they're loyal. They're liabilities." That was the moment I realized Daniel had inherited Dad's business, but not his values. That night, I finally opened Dad's notebook. Most pages contained observations about employees, machines, and leadership. But one thing stood out. Certain words appeared again and again. Trust, character, loyalty. Then a folded map slipped from the back cover. Dad had written 6 words across the bottom. "The answers aren't in my office." The map pointed to an abandoned workshop on company property, a place nobody had entered in years. Before sunrise the next morning, I unlocked the workshop using a tiny key hidden inside the notebook. The room was covered in dust, except for one workbench. It looked freshly cleaned. Sitting on top was a small, locked wooden box. Attached to it was another note from Dad. If you're reading this, you finally understood what really mattered. I reached for the box. Then headlights flashed through the workshop windows. Someone else had followed me. The headlights stopped outside the abandoned workshop. My heart started racing. Dad had only left the notebook, the map, and the key to me. So who else knew about this place? I grabbed the wooden box and stepped behind an old machine. The workshop door creaked open. Footsteps echoed through the empty building. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Noah, I know you're here." It was Daniel. He swept his flashlight across the room before spotting me. "I knew you were hiding something," he said. "I saw you leave the lawyer's office with that notebook." His eyes landed on the wooden box. "So you found it?" I nodded. "Dad wanted me to." Daniel stepped forward. "Everything Dad owned belongs to me." I looked him in the eye. "The company belongs to you. There's a difference." For a moment, I thought he would try to take the box. Instead, he smiled. "You'll tell me what's inside eventually." As he walked away, he looked back. "You have no idea what Dad was really hiding." Those words stayed with me. After he left, I unlocked the wooden box. There wasn't any money, no stock certificates, no deeds. Inside were only 3 things: a faded photograph, several handwritten letters, and an old brass key. The photograph showed Dad standing beside 5 factory workers outside the very first Harper manufacturing building. On the back, he'd written, "The people who built my dream." The brass key carried a small tag, "Archive Room." I'd worked at Harper Manufacturing for years. There wasn't an archive room, at least one anyone talked about. Back in the notebook, I found another clue. Some records are too valuable to keep in plain sight. The clue led me beneath the oldest section of the factory. Hidden behind an old storage room was a locked steel door. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside was a forgotten basement filled with dusty shelves, old blueprints, employee records, and decades of company history. At the center stood a locked filing cabinet. Inside, I found the real treasure. Not money, truth. Dad had written personal notes about hundreds of employees, not about profits, not about performance, about character. One mechanic secretly paid another worker's medical bills. A receptionist worked every Christmas so single parents could stay home. A welder refused a bribe that would have cost the company millions. Dad had recorded every act of honesty, sacrifice, and loyalty. At the bottom of the cabinet sat a thick envelope labeled "Future CEO." Inside were 2 sealed letters, one for Daniel, one for me. I opened Daniel's first. "Daniel, if you're reading this, you probably inherited the company. A company isn't built by executives. It's built by the people who unlock the doors every morning. Forget them, and you'll lose everything." Then I opened mine. "Noah, you always believed success comes from solving problems instead of creating them. That's why I trusted you with what mattered most. Not my company, my legacy." I sat there in silence. For the first time, I understood why Dad left me the notebook. Hidden behind the letters was one final document, a legally registered employee ownership trust. 40% of Harper Manufacturing no longer belonged to our family. It belonged to the employees. But there was one condition. The trust could only become active if the trustee approved it. I looked at the signature. The trustee was me. A week later, Daniel announced another round of layoffs. Employees gathered outside the factory to protest. Inside the boardroom, our company attorney walked in carrying a file. "We have a problem." Daniel sighed. "What now?" "The Employee Ownership Trust." Daniel frowned. "What trust?" The attorney handed him the paperwork. His face went pale. "This has to be fake."
It was legally registered 18 years ago. Daniel slammed the papers onto the table. Who's the trustee? The attorney looked toward me. Noah. The room fell completely silent. That evening, Daniel came to my house carrying a leather briefcase. I want to make a deal. He opened the case. Inside were contracts, investment accounts, and property deeds. I'll give you $50 million. For what? I asked. The notebook, the trust, everything Dad left you. I couldn't help smiling. You still don't understand. It was never about the notebook. It was never about the trust. It was about the lesson. Daniel stood up angrily. I don't care about lessons. I care about keeping the company. I quietly replied, and that's exactly why Dad never trusted you with it. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned toward the door. If I lose this company, you lose your brother. I watched him leave. The painful truth was, I'd already lost him years ago. The next morning, an emergency board meeting was called. Every director, every attorney, every major shareholder. The chairman stood and cleared his throat. The Employee Ownership Trust has officially been activated. Daniel shot to his feet. You can't do this. The chairman looked at me. Only one person can decide what happens next. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I stood slowly. I've made my decision. Before I could say another word, the boardroom doors swang open. An elderly woman walked in carrying another worn leather notebook. She looked directly at me, then quietly said, Your father told me this day would come. She held up the notebook, and what you're holding is only half of the story.
The boardroom doors swung open. Every conversation stopped. An elderly woman stepped inside, carrying a worn leather notebook that looked almost identical to the one in my hands. She walked slowly but confidently, as if she'd expected this moment for years. The chairman frowned. I'm sorry, ma'am, this is a private meeting. She smiled politely. I know. Then she looked directly at me. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I worked with your father for 38 years. Daniel frowned. I've never heard of you. She nodded. That doesn't surprise me. You spent your life looking at people with titles. Your father spent his life looking at people with character. The room fell silent. Eleanor carefully placed her notebook beside mine. William told me that if this company ever forgot why it existed, I was to bring this. She opened the notebook. Every page was filled with Dad's familiar handwriting, not financial records, not business plans, stories, names, moments, acts of kindness nobody else had ever noticed. She turned to one page. When the factory flooded in 1998, she said softly, everyone remembers William staying all night. She smiled. But what nobody remembers is that he stayed because one young employee refused to leave until every machine had been shut down safely. She looked at me. That employee was you. I blinked. I was 16. You were. You worked 18 hours without being asked. Your father wrote 4 pages about that night. I had no memory of it meaning anything. To Dad, it had meant everything. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. This doesn't change anything. We're here to discuss ownership. Eleanor calmly reached into her folder. It changes more than you think. She unfolded a yellowed sheet of paper. This is the very first mission statement your father ever wrote. The paper was stained with grease. The ink had faded. At the bottom, one sentence had been underlined 3 times. We will never make $1 by forgetting the people who earned it. No one spoke. Then Eleanor turned toward the chairman. I have one request. Before anyone votes, let the people William built this company with speak. The chairman hesitated before nodding.
The boardroom doors opened again. An elderly machinist walked in first. His hands were scarred from decades of hard work. He looked directly at Daniel. "Your father hired me when nobody else would. I had made mistakes. I had a criminal record. Everyone closed their doors. Your father didn't. He told me one bad decision shouldn't define an entire life." The old man smiled through tears. "I've worked here 34 years. Next came a retired receptionist. "When my husband died, I couldn't afford childcare. I was going to quit. Your father quietly paid for daycare for almost a year. He never told anyone." Then a maintenance supervisor stepped forward. Every Christmas Eve, William walked through every department. He thanked every cleaner, every security guard, every janitor. He believed nobody was invisible. One by one, employees filled the room. Every story revealed another side of my father. A man who remembered birthdays, who visited sick employees in hospital, who attended funerals, who secretly paid tuition for workers' children, not because it helped the business, because it was the right thing to do. Finally, a retired welder slowly reached into his pocket. He unfolded an old paycheck. On the back, Dad had written a single sentence: "No company succeeds alone." Daniel stared at the floor. His shoulders dropped. For the first time since Dad died, he stopped defending himself. He quietly asked, "Why didn't he ever tell me these things?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "He tried. You were too busy learning how to run a company. He was trying to teach you how to lead people." Those words hit harder than anything she'd said. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Noah Harper, as trustee, the decision now belongs to you." Every person in the room turned toward me. Reporters waited outside. Employees waited across the factory. Daniel looked at me, not with anger, with fear. I stood slowly. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I placed Dad's notebook on the table. "I've made my decision." Daniel closed his eyes, certain he already knew what I was about to say. "I will not become CEO." The room exploded with whispers. Even Daniel looked confused. One director leaned forward. "Then who will?" I took a slow breath. My father spent 30 years building a company, but he spent even longer building a culture. If we simply replace one Harper with another, we've learned nothing. I turned toward the board. "I want an independent CEO, chosen for experience, not because of a last name." Then I looked toward the employees sitting quietly at the back of the room. "The employee trust remains. 40% of this company will always belong to the people who built it. No future owner can take that away." I continued. "Employees will elect representatives to the board. Executive bonuses will depend on employee retention, safety, and customer satisfaction, not just quarterly profits." Silence. Then one director started clapping. Another joined. Within seconds, every board member was on their feet. The proposal passed unanimously. The reporters outside rushed to break the news. By evening, every business channel in the country was talking about Harper Manufacturing. Some called it revolutionary. Others called it reckless. Dad would have simply called it fair. Later that night, I returned to the old workshop. The machines sat exactly where they'd always been, covered in grease, covered in memories. I heard footsteps behind me. It was Daniel. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he broke the silence. "I hated you." I looked at him. "I know." "I thought Dad loved you more." I shook my head. "He didn't. He believed in us differently." Daniel laughed bitterly. "I spent my whole life trying to impress him, and I spent mine trying to understand him." He nodded slowly. I finally read both notebooks. There wasn't a single page where he compared us. He only wrote about who we could become. For the first time, I saw tears in my brother's eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the old company keys, and held them toward me. "I don't deserve these." I gently pushed his hand away. "No, but you do deserve another chance." He looked surprised. "After everything?" Dad believed people could grow. If I don't believe that too, then everything he taught us dies with him. Daniel lowered his head. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, that was enough." Instead of leaving the company, Daniel accepted a position as operations manager. No executive office, no special treatment. He worked on the factory floor. He learned every department. He listened more than he spoke. At first, employees didn't trust him. He understood why, so he never asked for forgiveness. He simply showed up every day. Slowly, people noticed. A year later, Harper Manufacturing had its best year in nearly 2 decades. Not because expenses had been cut, because people cared again. Turnover dropped to record lows. Product quality reached its highest level ever. Customers returned. The company grew. Not because we found better machines, but because we rebuilt trust. On the first anniversary of Dad's passing, Daniel and I visited his grave together. No lawyers, no shareholders, no reporters, just 2 sons. Daniel placed an old wrench on the headstone, the first tool Dad ever gave me. I placed the worn leather notebook beside it, the last lesson he ever gave me. We stood there quietly. Then Daniel smiled quietly. "I used to think Dad left me everything." I looked at him. "But now?" He laughed softly. "Now I know he left me the easy part, the company. You got the difficult part." I smiled. "What was that?" He looked toward Dad's name carved into the stone. "Learning what really mattered." As we walked away, I realized something. People think an inheritance is measured in dollars, in property, in businesses. My brother inherited all of those things. I inherited something money could never buy: a notebook, a few letters, and the understanding that success isn't measured by what you own, it's measured by the lives you leave better than you found them. Years ago, my brother took everything Dad left behind, except the one thing that truly mattered: his legacy. And unlike money, a legacy only grows when it's shared.